We are on the 26th of September 2021. Happy birthday, Deborah. I hope you had a wonderful time. This is the book, and it's a beautiful book. I've already recorded 6, but this is especially for you to hear them because I know that you don't get the notifications, so you won't have heard them yet until I email you. So this is a book, Wise Owl and Barn Owl, and it's on the lives of these. I'll read the back page. By finding an injured pigeon in the Strand, 2 amazing variety club artists, Louis and Yvonne VENICE, first began to care for wild creatures. Upon their move to Berkshire, Newbury actually, they started up their own wildlife hospital, knowing of no other in the country at that time. This is in the 1960s. Foxes, badgers, deer, squirrels, a polecat, bats, and every variety of birds were brought to them, even an oiled heron from as far away as the Clyde. Their experiences were many, from rescuing fox cubs born in a tombstone to separating 2 male swans involved in combat. Although Louis suffered a sex change and became known as Louise, they pioneered against cruelty to wild creatures for over 30 years, appearing on television several times in programs such as TV's Country Ways and Magpie, and in numerous illustrated articles to the national press. Wise Owl and Barn Owl were their code names for CB radio. So we're going to begin now with chapter 1. "Stop that ruddy maniac!" called someone, as a mad driver broke the speed limit in the Strand, screeched on 2 wheels past a row of vehicles, and careered through the traffic lights. But this was London, and who cared? Time meant money. Time meant catching the tube or bus from Aldwych or a taxi from Fleet Street. Time meant buying fashions, Oxford Street or currency at the Bank of England or the Stock Exchange. Racing the great printing presses to roll off the Daily and Time for Yvonne and myself as variety club artists meant appearing on stage for the evening performance. Yet in the gutter lay something motionless, something injured. It was a feral pigeon, its right wing bleeding underneath where it had received a gash from the car. Its orange eyes gazed in bewilderment. Its metallic green neck feathers illuminated the white and grey of the rest of its body. And as we picked it up, we asked, what do we know about doctoring birds? We knew nothing at all. We also knew we could not leave it there. Nestled into Yvonne's arms, Creature journeyed home with, and once in the kitchen, we bathed its wound gently with a disinfectant, gave it a drink, settled it down in a cardboard box with a hot water bottle. It was 6 o'clock. Within an hour and a half, our public would be waiting for us. We took the Underground to Tottenham Court Road, and in the dressing room of the Scala Theatre, hastily donned costumes and applied our makeup. Soon the opening music struck up. Back came the curtains, and we began our double act, known as the VENICEs, a play on our names, Louise, Yvonne's, VENICE. Lithely I performed acrobatic comic sketches or tap danced, and then as I strummed George Formby songs upon the ukulele, played country and western music upon the accordion, Yvonne sang with her lovely soprano voice. What years those were in the 1950s. Tomorrow we were at Prestatyn for a concert party, the next day at Leicester, and then on to Nottingham, York, and all over the north of England. We had done it countless times. But this time we took an extra passenger with us, a pigeon living in the van. Firstly, We had to learn how to feed Percy, who refused absolutely and to eat. We discovered we had to force feed him, and that the only way for him was food was in paste between rehearsals. While Yvonne held him, I administered wild bird food mixed with soaked bread down the back of his throat. Water had to be given by means of a syringe. It was almost a week that continued this ritual, when to our surprise and relief, Percy began to peck for himself, but his wound took far too long to respond. If ever he attempted to fly from hands, his feeble effort always ended with a thud. Obviously hurt him a great deal. We continued to apply Acreflex on cotton wool buds, realizing that he had plenty of time. Percy, meanwhile, became very knowing. Each morning he was with us, a roo, roo, roo. As I held his warm, soft body, he would cling to my fingers as if they were a twig. It gave us the idea to make a perch for him. At the time we were traversing the Welsh valleys, and we found a broken bough, which we erected in the van. Percy took to this and settled upon it, as if he had used it all his life. He had objection to the vibration of the engine, and was surely the most travelled pigeon the whole country had ever seen. One morning, a month later, when we were in Blackpool, we found to our surprise that he was not on his bough. We looked everywhere for him amongst all the props, and eventually discovered him travelling in the travelling case piled up high in the van. He could fly. We attempted to coax him down, and very cautiously he made the effort, taking small lengths at a time. Day by day he became bolder and would fly down for his food. We sensed that he could well fly greater distances if in open air. 3 days later we returned to London. His wound was healed, and we decided to test his reactions, taking him gently from his box into the greenery of St. James's Park. We threw him up into the air. Percy sensed the joy of freedom, the ecstasy of life in his body, soared briefly in a westerly direction, then changing course, flew southwards over the trees without deliberation until he was out of sight. We watched, both exulted yet sad. We knew we should never see him again. The next week we were due at the Carlton Club in Nottingham, and the next at the White Hart at Thorne near Doncaster. Being 10 years older than Yvonne, I'd had more experience in showbiz. First of all, performing whole evening acts with Percy Swinscoe and Neville King, the ventriloquist, who became a top artist in the black and white minstrel show. But when I married Yvonne and she wished to join the group, the other two insisted that they did not want a fourth member, so she and I had decided to go it alone. Showbiz was a great life for 5 years, together performing whole night acts. Then one day, Yvonne's health began to deteriorate. It seemed as if the hectic life was becoming too much for her, and I noticed that she was losing weight. Yet she continued valiantly until several weeks later, when the scales registered an alarming 6 stone. "Right to the surgery," I commanded. The doctor took one look at her over his half glasses and remarked, "Give up or else." It was as if our world had come to an end, but it was our pioneering spirit that carried us through. And when Yvonne had fully recovered, we took every job that we could find. The first was running church clubs for teddy boys in poverty-stricken parts of London. And sweet are the uses of adversity, Shakespeare said. With this new life, we first discovered what a priceless thing it is to have time for leisure. We also had time to look after wildlife. Percy had been the source of inspiration to us. He had shown us that there was a place in this world for the nursing of wild creatures, and an idea came to us. Why could we not place postcards in shop windows so that the public could help us, bring us their casualties to care for? We tried it, and it worked. It was in August 1964 when we moved to a new job in the town of Newbury in Berkshire that we decided to open the Newbury Wildlife Hospital, a thing unheard of in those days. Our white board, painted in red, was hung up on the door, and it announced that we were open day and night, and our van was given a headboard to become an ambulance. To our knowledge, it was the first in the country. That's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 is in 1964. Church House, where we lived, was a solid Victorian building adjoining the parish rooms, with a sizable garden at the front, suitable for our wildlife, and it lay among a narrow passage leading down to the canal. On the opposite side stood the church, dedicated to St. Nicholas, of which I had become the verger, and with its fine perpendicular tower, surmounted by pinnacles, dominated the canal and the loch. Newbury held a cattle and general market on Thursdays, and on those days the streets swarmed with country folk coming in to buy and sell their wares. We were surprised by the doorbell ringing one such morning to find an elderly man from Aldermaston clutching something which he had brought in his bicycle basket. "Heard terrible squealing in me fruit cage," he explained, "and found he caught up in the netting." It was a male hedgehog in a pathetic state, and I donned some gloves and took it from him. The netting had entwined itself so tightly round his entire body that it was enough to sever his tiny head and legs. It is nothing for a hedgehog to become caught up in netting or string left around by careless people. It required 2 pairs of hands to deal with it, and Yvonne and I began stripping the netting from round his neck. But once his head was free, Prickles rolled himself into a tight ball, wrapping his paws around his face. We tried tempting him with pieces of meat held in the direction of his nose, but he refused to be coaxed. The little fellow had probably spent several hours in his predicament overnight, and he was in severe state of shock. We achieved little by little, with endless patience, snipping each square to remove the cords bound tightly round his legs. They were cut to the bone, and we applied Acreflex to heal them, an ointment that is harmless to wildlife if licked. It was then a tricky business to hold them open while we freed his front and even his tiny underparts. Then at last we were able to lift the netting from his coat. Within a trice he had rolled himself into a tight ball again, and there was nothing for it but to let him sleep off his shock in a warm box in a cupboard. The job had taken us an entire hour. On the north side of the church, the Kennet was diverted to form a waterfall to work the town flour mill, and both sides were a haven for myriads of waterfowl. It was nearing the end of the summer. Swans glided gracefully with their cygnets, now a sludgy white and growing larger week by week, while mallards upended moorhens and coots dabbled in the reeds, and tiny dabchicks, or lesser grebes, dived under water. It was a scene of peace. Yet, for all that, we were beginning to learn that the Kennet was also a hazardous place for unsuspecting wildlife. Careless anglers would leave their tackle behind, and a boy came to us one afternoon in a flurried state, a swan by the bridge as a fishing hook lodged in its throat. I followed him along the towpath to the spot where it was, and my heart missed a beat. It was a cygnet, still with its parents. Swans, with their mighty wing joints and heavy bones, are capable of drowning a man, and I was aware of that situation. It was precarious, to say the least. A male swan, when fighting, will seize its opponent by the back of the neck. This hold will cause its attacker to collapse, and this is what I had to do now. Summoning all my courage, I managed to lure the distressed creature to the bank, and with one dart grabbed its neck and pulled it out of the river to the accompaniment of vicious hissings and imminent attack of the parent birds. Then, as swiftly as I dared, I eased the hook out and returned their offspring to them. Sweet success! Suddenly loud cheers echoed from all directions around me, and I looked up. An appreciative audience had gathered on the opposite bank and on the bridge to watch. It was a repetition of the old familiar ring of the nightclub days, but this time hopefully there would be no encore. The canal was a pleasant place for a stroll in the evening, and we made it our regular exercise. It was there that we first met Fluffy, the miller's big black cat, lurking for mice. Fluffy consistently rubbed himself round our legs, enjoying the fuss. He would walk with us as far as the two quaint weavers' cottages, for Newbury had once been a rich woolen town, and every citizen had made a living off the sheep's back. At that point, Fluffy would come no further, and we would cross the iron bridge to wander back towards the lock. On the opposite side stood another tall old mill, but now disused, and between that and the lock-keeper's cottage was a piece of waste ground containing some stables and a peacock wandering around amongst the overgrown vegetation. One evening in late October, a heap of empty fish boxes had also arrived at the scene. Strange, horses living at the scene, living on fish, we remarked, and our curiosity got the better of us. We climbed over the fence and took an unauthorized peep inside the stables. 100 or more ferret-like creatures stared at us from individual cages, their glossy dark fur tinged with blue. "A mink farm," Yvonne announced without hesitation, and feeling sickened, we departed on our way. From the lock-keeper's cottage came the sound of hammering, and we guessed he was busy repairing his rowing boats, which he hired out on the wharf. John Gould even owned the two motor launches, Kelston and Limply Stoke, which sailed up and down the canal, taking the public on joyrides. At the sound of our approach, Buffer, his Jack Russell, came running out to meet us with a series of woofs. His master stopped his work and came out also, ever eager for someone to chat to. A unique man, tall and thin, with a thirst for open-air life. He was always a mine of information, and we commented on the quantity of fish for the mink. "Oh yes, they're blue mink. Mink were introduced into this country from America in about 1929, you know. Their natural habitat is river banks and fens, so that's why their food is mainly fish, although their eyesight underwater is poor. In the wild, they'll also kill poultry if they have a mind to, and even rabbits." As he continued talking, a team of bell ringers suddenly commenced their weekly practice, and the great stone edifice of St. Nicholas standing opposite us in the sunset sprang to life. I often think what a fine church that is. Have you heard of Jacko Newbury? He built it. His real name was John Winchcombe, the richest wool merchant we ever had. He even entertained the king and all his court at his house up the road. Still there now. Which king? Henry VIII. Jack felt the old church was not large enough, so he pulled it down and paid to have this one built. Can you imagine that today? The churchyard was far larger in past centuries, of course, even extended to the south. Wait a moment, we interrupted. That is where Church House is now. We must be living among the dead. He threw back his head and gave a roar of laughter. They'll not rise up now after all these years. He returned to his work, chuckling to himself, and called, although they might do tonight, it's Halloween, eh? Late in the night, an eerie sound awoke us from our sleep. It was not spirits, but a ring of the front door bell. We seized our dressing gowns, went downstairs, and a young couple called, We've brought a barn owl with a broken wing. We unlocked the door and took the patient from them. It was a beautiful bird, its dark brown eyes glimmering from a heart-shaped face, its white underparts and face glowing a ghostly white. It was obvious why some folk call them the white owl. We thanked them and put Barney to bed. But as soon as daylight dawned, we knew we would have to mend that wing before it became set. We needed advice and telephoned Peter Scott at Slimbridge. His reply was that he did not look after injured birds. Who were we to turn to? There was no one. We had to teach ourselves, and so we did, by trial and error. It was broken between the shoulder and the elbow, and being a large species of bird, we guessed it would take 8 to 12 weeks to mend. We held the wing in its natural flight position, and taking a lolly stick, sliced it lengthways down the centre to make 2 splints. Then we applied one to the top side of the wing and the other parallel to it to the underside. In those days, micropore had not been invented, but we bound them round with a reel of thin elastoplast, 1/2 inch wide, taking care not to splint the wing at the elbow itself, for it would have restricted its flight. We realized that any splint must only reach as far as the bend. Next, we mended his individual feathers, firstly by separating the barbs and binding them again with elastoplast round each shaft, then smoothed the barbs back to their natural position. It seemed to work, and day by day Barney's confidence began to return. But getting him to eat was a different matter. When we left his meat diced in a row along his perch, he always left it untouched. We tried force-feeding him, but just as we thought he had digested it, each time he regurgitated it all, and we were back to square one. We began to learn lesson 1. It is impossible to force-feed a barn owl. His natural diet would have been voles and mice covered in fur, and we had an idea. We decided to go to the butcher's to acquire a rabbit skin. Then we cut it up, rolled it carefully around each piece of stewing steak, and left it on his perch. It did the trick. Next morning his food had gone. We too performed this ritual methodically every night, but alas, the next week there was a crisis. No rabbits. have been brought in this week, the butcher told us, attired in his striped apron. I'm sorry. Once more we were in despair. Barney refused to eat again. In the evening we took our usual stroll along the canal. Fluffy, the miller's cat, prowling outside, ran towards us, rubbing himself round our legs in the usual greeting. You're molting, Fluffy, we said, as countless hairs were distributed over our slacks. Fluffy, you are the answer, I exclaimed suddenly. Allow me a handful of your beautiful fur. I pulled it out gently and took it back home. Then, wrapping each piece of meat in the black ball of fluff, we left it along Barney's perch. In the morning, Fluffy's fur lay tussed on the ground, but the meat had gone. That's the end of chapter 2. So we're going to continue with chapter 3, which was in 1965. Spring arrived, the time when nature is alive with productivity, and the time Yvonne declared when her products all find their way to our hospital. Boxes of nestlings and fledglings began arriving. Some left in the emergency cages in the garden when we were out. Most of the contents bore no resemblance to their parents at all. Little brown fledglings with spotted breasts and brown beaks were blackbirds. Curious grey fledglings without a hint of speckles were starlings. Tiny speckled brown balls of fluff represented robins, while some were unattractive little bald specimens without a hint of feathers at all. To keep them protected, we put the nestlings in boxes in the warmth of the airing cupboard, well ventilated, and the fledglings in cages in the spare bedroom. It is nature's miracle, the way the mother senses that the climate is right to lay and incubate her eggs, so that her young are hatched at the exact time to feed upon emerging caterpillars, grubs, or insects. But the job had now been handed over to us. We had to find a substitute, something as moist as the natural food, softened by the parents' saliva. Tiny gaping mouths waited in all directions from 6 in the morning until dusk, the nestlings demanding theirs every 2 hours and the fledglings every 4. But it was an impossible task to find enough insects. We mixed chick crumb with raw egg. Excuse me a moment. And in desperation gave them morsels of tinned cat food. But it was not adequate. Only half were surviving, and we were burying sad little corpses. What did the doctor have to say? Asked Yvonne one day, as we wiped our brows, perplexed. The doctor? Who wrote that book that we found in the Charing Cross Road shop? Oh, I recall the book that she meant. It was one we'd found one day in London while browsing in the dusty alcoves of the Dickensian bookshops, a small illustrated book, its pages yellowed with age. I searched around and found it. It was entitled British Birds, Their Successful Management in Captivity. Actually, if you hold on a moment, I'm very uncomfortable on this chair. It's no good for my back. I suffer with my back, so I've decided that I better move myself across to the other chair where I'll be more comfortable to continue with this book. So excuse me a minute, and I'll have to take the drink as well. Hold on. This is worse when you're live, isn't it? Because when I got backache, I can't cope. Sorry about that. I can't cope with the pain. I don't take anything for it. So I'll continue reading. This is better for me. At least I'm more comfortable. Sorry about this. Is this coming upward? If I bring it up, it'll be better. Yeah, that's more comfortable for me. I'll return back to the captivity. Captivity with other allied information for fanciers, published 1891. Birdcage Walk in London is a living memorial to the poor. Wild birds snared and caged in those days. Linnet Terrace in Cambridgeshire is yet another, built in 1904, from the proceeds of selling linnets at a penny each. It was quite deplorable, yet the information which Dr. J. Denham Bradburn had collected on the care of them was invaluable. I read the piece about feeding on page 12. Here is something: mealworms, the larvae of a beetle which thrives in large flour mills. Perhaps the miller could help us. The beetles can be kept in large jars, fed on oat or barley meal, and will lay their eggs on sacking. I just wondered if the sound is changed by my moving. So I ought to maybe move the microphone in case it's not picking up. Sorry about this. This is what happens probably when you go live. I hadn't thought of the microphone until I saw it was over there, and I thought, I don't know, it's a very good microphone, Rhodes. Sorry about the interruptions, but I should have thought about backing. Okay, I will continue. My apologies. So I'll go back to Dr. J. Denham. Dr. J. Denham Bradburn had collected on the care of them was invaluable. I read the piece about feeding on page 12, and here is something: mealworms, the larva of a beetle which thrives in large flour mills. Perhaps the miller could help us. The beetles can be kept in large jars, fed on oat or barley meal, and will lay their eggs on sacking. I stopped. Oh, that is no good. They should not be disturbed for 3 months or so. We need something immediately. I read on. What about gentles, the larvae of the blowfly? It seems they can be produced very quickly, although the doctor did not want anything to do with it. He says all you need do is hang up any offal and you will soon meet with your reward: plenty of maggots and plenty of filth and smells. Well, we need not hang it up. We could bury it, Yvonne ventured. Yes, we could, I agreed, wondering why I had not thought of it. Come along then. Let us see what Mr. Lydiard on the bridge has to say or to offer. You could try tripe, he volunteered, pushing his straw boater to the back of his head. Why, there are some pig's livers about to be thrown out. We will take it, we said, thanking him. We packed it all in our bag and returned home. We lay it out on the earth, just below the topsoil, covering it speedily. I fancied it was already beginning to smell, which which only couldn't have been my imagination in anticipation of the joys to come. Next day, we uncovered it. It was seething with white maggots, and we filled a polythene box with the wriggling things. A pair of tweezers made a marvellous thing for the parent's beak, and the fledgling blackbirds never failed to amuse us. Each one, when about to take a tweezerful or three or more, always gave a hearty chirrup, chirrup, chirrup. The starlings, the squawkies, however, gaped their mouths open wide as soon as they saw it, but snapped them shut before the food was inside. It was a work of art to get it in, and when in, unless we pushed it to the backs of their throats, it was never swallowed. Usually, they would have the tweezers in their beaks, and then it would shake their heads, and the food would fly everywhere. A syringe did not prove an easy method by which to administer water. So we hit on the idea of giving them the chip crumbs soaked in water on the broad end of a nail file. The tiny pied wagtails and blue tits, each about 2.5 inches long, were a far greater task. They refused to open their beaks like minute pins, and there was only one way to prise them open gently from the side and force feed them. The maggots had proved to be the answer, but if we did not use them up within a week, they became stiff and still and began pupating. Then every single one of our charges refused point blank to touch them. The answer was to keep them in a ventilated polythene box in the refrigerator. At length, a cheeky starling plus 2 of the blackbirds began to feed themselves from a dish, the food flying everywhere, and it was amusing to watch them. We had had them for 2.5 weeks, and we knew that they would show us when they were sufficiently matured to go. Meanwhile, the number of waterfowl in trouble on the river was increasing quite alarmingly. Not only were fishing hooks caught round the heads or legs of swans and ducks, but reports were coming to us of a practice in fashion by young hooligans. They would seize a duck, fasten a rubber band around its bill and the back of its head, preventing the poor creature from opening its mouth, and so it would die of starvation. When a duck was terrorized, it was impossible to catch it on the bank. One day, we had to borrow one of the lock keeper's boats to row after one and rescue it. It was no easy matter chasing a duck up and down river in an attempt to lasso it with a large fishing net. Ducks are wonderful flyers, and it meant getting John Gould to open the lock gates and the swing bridge. Even then, the poor thing, flapping its wings, desperately raced away, escaping us. Still, the fledgling season was not over, and we never expected to receive our next patient, a baby kingfisher. He was a source of delight. Even as a fledgling, his colours were beautiful, and his metallic blue-green led us to name him Sapphire. The problem was to find ways of feeding him, and there was nothing for it to set off with armed with a fishing net and a jam jar down to the river. We soon became expert minnowers. After 2 weeks, he began to fly small distances, and we decided to provide a miniature pond for him in his pen, which we filled with minnows. Sapphire loved it, We watched him diving from his little bow and catching them himself, first tossing them into the air, then swallowing them head first. When a month had passed by, his wings and tail were mature, and when we discovered his underbeak was turning red, we discovered that Sapphire was a female. Her senses were keen, and we decidedly, sadly, that we must take the gamble to see if she could cope with the big world outside. We knew a protected tree-lined spot along the bank of the canal at Speen and Moors. We took her there and set her free. Sapphire perched on a low overhanging bough of a willow tree, watching the current uncertainly, for that is what seemed an eternity. She did nothing and then, eventually, disappeared amongst the foliage. An hour later, we returned to see if she was adapting to her natural habitat, but also she had completely gone. For days afterwards, we searched for her again, but Sapphire was enjoying her new life, nowhere to be seen. It was months later in August, as we were taking a stroll along that part of the canal, that a sudden streak of electric blue skimmed upriver, and we were 90% sure that it was Sapphire. She had shown us that she was a true creature of the wild again and gave us a sense of reward. We made our way home. How was it, we asked each other as we walked, that with their tropical colours, kingfishers ever came to be a native of our isles, and left willing to endure with us the ice of winter, freezing to their bow? It was a wonder of nature to me. The miniature pond that we had provided for Sapphire in her pen proved advantageous whenever we had tiny orphan ducklings or cygnets to nurse. But the trouble was we had no large pond for injured waterfowl like swans, Canada geese, or ducks. We had thought about making one for some time and had acquired a strong PVC liner from a garden centre resistant to claws. Now it required a search through an instructional gardening book to learn the do's and do nots of a pond building. It was midday, and there was a knock at the door. It was interesting to note how we came to know a complete cross-section of the public in our new venture, from the richest to the poorest. Around Newbury, there are many landed estates, and this time it was Lady Porchester from the Highclere estate, whose father-in-law was the 6th Earl of Carnarvon. She had come to ask for advice. "I have a pet quail," she told us. "Quail's eggs are a sought-after delicacy for the table. There is nothing wrong with her wings, but she will not fly. Quails always live and feed on the ground," we explained. "They're very secretive creatures, hidden among crops on farmlands, and normally only fly when disturbed by sportsmen or predators. They are known as bottom feeders." She laughed at the term. "I see. Thank you so much for your help," and drove off. A week later, she returned with an injured drake. "I spotted this poor thing by our lake. You see, it has a broken leg. Could you please look after it?" "Of course," we said. "We will mend the leg. And would you mind if we release him again on your estate once he's better?" "Whenever possible, we like to return our patients to where they were found." "Any time you wish," she replied, and left a donation for his keep. Yvonne took him, naming him Charlie. He was a handsome mallard, with the characteristic iridescent green head changing to purple in a different light. As the drakes mature, so their colours become brighter, and Charlie's bill was a vivid yellow, which indicated that he was at least 2 years old. Yet his poor orange leg hung limply. "I will see to him," she said, and disappeared into the kitchen. I remained in the garden to begin making a hole for the pond. In the cool of the evening, I dug and I dug, and I dug and I dug, but I soon learned that it was not easy going. The ground could not have been touched for years, and the soil was rock hard. Charlie's leg was broken in the place most common, I thought, as I worked, just below the knee joint, and being a large bird like Barney, it would take 8 to 12 weeks to mend. He seemed quite fearless of humans. Maybe families on the estate or the groundsmen had been used to feeding him. He would enjoy swimming in his pond while recuperating. I continued digging. Yvonne was expert at first aid. I knew she would use lollipop sticks, again invaluable when mending legs of large birds, and this time she would bind them with a roll of 2-inch elastoplast to each side of the legs, definitely not to the front and back, so that the poor bird could not move, and at least 1/4 of an inch above the foot and 1/4 of an inch below the knee joint. I continued perspiring. Being a waterfowl, of course, she would then take a sheet of waterproof green oil, skin from the chemist, the sort a mother would use to cover his lint, to cover our cut knees as children, and cut it into strips to cover her work. Charlie could then swim to his heart's content, all the while that his leg was mending. Phew! What hot work it was! Suddenly, my spade hit against something hard. I dug further and unearthed 2 objects. Yvonne was still in the kitchen, obviously having taken a liking to Charlie. She was talking to him as I waltzed in, wiping my brow, and I asked, "Good heavens, what have you got there?" "Have a guess." She took them from me and scrutinized them, removing the soil. "It cannot be." "Yes, it is a pair of brass coffin handles." That is the end of chapter 3. So I'll have another sip of drink and then I'll continue with chapter 4. Chapter 4 is in 1966. It was the beginning of July, and a van drew up in the road. Out stepped a man in uniform, walked down the alleyway, and rang deftly at the doorbell. "Good morning. I'm Brian Sanders, the new RSPCA inspector. I've heard all about your hospital. Have you room for an eagle owl?" He produced a cage covered with a blanket, and we peered underneath. Blinking nervously at the daylight was the tiniest of baby owls, the size of a tennis ball. "Oh, a little owl. That will be our first one." "That is Bob," he announced jovially. "Every time I look at him, he bobs up and down." "Well, would you and Bob like to come in?" The man stepped inside. He was tall and thin, with brown curly hair, and in no time had settled himself on a stool in the kitchen, sipping a mug of tea and chatting amiably. It appeared that he was straight out of college, Amongst other things, he owned no less than 3 bulldogs, and his hobby was riding around on a motorbike, the dogs accompanying him in the sidecar. We also loved dogs and had quite a discussion about them. "How did you dream up the idea to run a wildlife hospital?" he asked, at last putting down his mug. "First one I had ever heard of. Mind if I look around?" "Feel free." We showed him the patients that were recuperating, those in intensive care in dark, confined spaces, and the newly made pond. He was obviously impressed. "And as you see, we are acquiring so many patients with scarcely enough cages." "What you really need is an aviary, is it not?" he replied thoughtfully. Then, suddenly, took an urgent look at his watch. "Oh, good heavens, I'm due at Thatcham 10 minutes ago. Be seeing you." And he went rushing off. We did see him again, and with his enthusiasm and dedication, he became, as ever, a ready help. Meanwhile, Bobby had been put into a cage in a dark corner to acclimatise to his new surroundings. He could only have been barely 5 weeks old, and being an orphan, remained huddled in his yellow eyes, looking lost and miserable. "What does the doctor have to say about you?" I asked, flicking over the yellow pages of the book. I came to the one headed "Little or French owls feed on rabbit or chopped raw beef at nightfall." We administered a drink of lacto, the mother's substitute, lest he was dehydrated, and fed him on finely minced beef suitable for a fledgling. The following day, Bobby's eyes looked a little brighter, and he ventured to move along his perch. Within a week, he had perked up considerably. From a shy, retiring little fledgling, he began to grow into a cheeky juvenile, each day becoming bolder. Upon seeing us at 6 o'clock in the morning, administering the breakfast round, he would start bobbing up and down at our approach, his yellow eyes now as bright as buttons, and giving a shrill, excited "Good morning, Bobby," we would greet him, and he would hold out his head to be tickled. Next morning we were busy and forgot to acknowledge him, and to our amusement he sat in the corner, head held down, and sulked. We discovered if we did not acknowledge him each morning, afterwards he did the same. Meanwhile, crises were still occurring on the fast-flowing Kennet. From West Mills, where we lived, the river flowed under the barrel-vaulted bridge in the main street and onto the wharf, where large groups of waterfowl resided. When a message came that a swan was caught up in the rushes near the police station, Inspector Bryan was the first to rescue. He and I borrowed one of the lockkeeper's clinker-built boats at the wharf and rowed steadily round to the back of the police station, amazed to see huge trout slithering in and out of the reeds. "The dream of any angler," Brian remarked, pulling at the oars, and then added, "I say, this boat is leaking. I'm getting wet. Are you?" I was decidedly, and it did not feel too comfortable, but there was no time to worry about things like that, for in a large clump of rushes that bordered the bank, there was the Swan. "It is a cob too," I hissed. "Look at the size of its neck." Our plan of attack was to row to the bank as quietly and unobtrusively as possible. Then, while Brian held back the rushes, My task was to approach it from the left, make a dash for the back of its neck with my left hand, and grasp it so that my right arm was wrapped firmly around its wings. Brian would then disentangle its feet. We neared it stealthily and were poised ready, when suddenly the swan was alerted. Already in a terrified state, it became even more aggressive than normal as it sensed our presence. With a flap of its mighty wings, the boat capsized, and we were sent sprawling into the water, wetter than before. Called Bobby as he detected my squelching footsteps returning along the alleyway, and I sensed it might even have been a laugh. Injured animals were brought to us at any time of the day or night, and when the doorbell rang at dusk one evening, we were presented with a baby pipistrelle bat. The tiny thing was no more 2¼ inches long and had a torn wing membrane. We prized open its microscopic mouth and gave it a drink of lacto. Then, knowing bats are cold-blooded, we worked swiftly and hammered together a wooden bat box, which we hung up high outside, where Batty could recover from its ordeal. There it hung upside down by its tiny feet. Next evening, we fed it with chopped insects that had been hovering around the window and pieces of maggots on the pointed end of a nail file. But afterwards, Batty returned to the original position, upside down, as pathetic as before. It was impossible for it to fly, and we knew it was only our intuition which could ever enable it to do so. Somehow we had to mend the wing. We needed something as weightless as the tiny woolen creature itself, and we scratched our heads. Should we use muslin, or maybe tulle, Tulle, tulle? Then Yvonne had an idea. She remembered that up in the loft was a pair of black, very, very fine denier stockings kept from our theatrical days. In a trice she disappeared up there and searched for them. Soon she returned triumphantly, then cut a piece large enough to cover the tear, which at least 3/4 of an inch to spare to extend round it. Now we needed 3 splints cut to the length of his veins to hold the nylon on either side of the tear, then down the centre. But what could we use that would be light enough? We decided on balsa wood. The next problem was what to use to secure them. We hit on invisible sellotape. We pulled Batty's wing out gently, looking in wonderment at the way its tiny claws were attached so perfectly to the ends. Then very, very carefully and gently we worked, covering every aspect of the jagged tear, and secured the sellotape over the edges of the wing so that no ends would penetrate to adhere to any foreign object. The job was finished, and we held the wing to the light. There were no gaps where air could get through, a very important point to ensure, and we returned Batty to its box to rest. Once again, it hung upside down and fell asleep, oblivious to the world about it. We continued to administer its feed to it every evening, hoping that the wing would heal. Batty took its time, and we could not believe our joy when 3 weeks later, after feeding, we noticed that he was attempting to unfold them. One night, as it balanced itself upon my hand in the usual way, It flapped them cautiously. "Look!" I cried. "It's trying to fly." Suddenly, as if making the final decision, Batty flitted away silently into the dusk. Called Bobby, joining in the excitement. A good dinner had just flown past his cage. In September, Brian called again. "My Bobby, how you've grown," he said, looking into his cage. "Twit, twit, twit, twit," replied Bobby, bobbing up and down. "That is his normal conversation," we exclaimed. "The kee 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 is reserved for exciting occasions like when he hears our footsteps in the alleyway. This morning, Brian was not in uniform, as he was on holiday, and he asked, "How about coming outside and being introduced to my mate then?" We followed him to where his motorbike was parked. Peering out from the sidecar was the large frame of a bulldog. Meet Caesar, the gentle giant, bounded, a panting and wheezing 52-pound hulk, his flat face slobbering in greeting. "His sisters, Jane and Cleo, are back home," he added. "Good gracious," I remarked, slapping and tickling Caesar affectionately. "What on earth do you feed them all on?" "Between them, they get through 3 pounds of meat a day mixed with biscuits. But you have to be careful." I watched some birds just now feeding, and one black one came away and he chased off the other birds, which looked like doves. I'm not as good as these people about what bird is what bird, but there's a whole heap of it out there. But I can see that the black ones I feed them. I put a lot of mixed corn seed out there on this big wooden bird thing, and I watch them. But now they're really feasting and they're fighting and shoving one another out to get their share. I better get on with reading this story. Sorry. So, meet Caesar. Right, we've read that bit. "What on earth do you feed them all on?" "Between them, they get through 3 pounds of meat a day, mixed with biscuits. But you have to be careful not to let them put on too much weight." We led them both inside. "I would love a dog," Yvonne announced enviously as she put the kettle on. "Any particular sort?" Brian asked as he sat down, with Caesar drooling over his feet. "The sublime to the ridiculous. It has to be a peak," I volunteered with a wink. "I do not suppose the RSPCA would have one?" Yvonne filled the pot and poured a bowlful for Caesar as well. Caesar lapped his up noisily, slopping half onto the floor. "I'm afraid not. People do not normally abandon peaks. But I will find out who breeds them if you like and give you a ring." Brian, as usual, was as good as his word. There was a breeder just a mile away called Lisa Gray, who happened to have a litter born on the 26th of July. We went to see her. Deep Nell Cottage was set back from the road opposite the Swan at Newtown. We rang the bell, and the door was opened to reveal a small, plump lady who took us through to her kennels. Adorable little bodies jumped up excitedly as we passed, their flat noses squashed against the wires. In the end, 6 healthy bundles of fluff, no bigger than kittens, confronted us with their mother. "Come along now, Eno," announced Lisa Gray kindly. "Let us see you." She scooped up one, explaining, "How do you like this one? He has not been reserved yet." She thrust the silky black bundle into Yvonne's arms. "He's simply gorgeous." gorgeous," she gasped, being licked to death by a wet tongue. "We will take him," we said without hesitation. When we came away, we had his pedigree and instructions on his care and feed. Bobby began his shrill call as soon as he heard us returning. "Yip, yip," responded Eno in surprise. "Kiki to you," answered Bobby, bobbing up and down as he saw him. "Meet Enop Satire of Deepnell," we said to Bobby, or rather Eno. "Eno has come to his new home. Autumn dawned, and under cover of its beautiful tints, we were to learn that there's always the annual horrific slaughter. This year it was inevitable again. Pheasants, rooks, and wood pigeons became the victims of sportsmen, and even protected species were shot in error. The maimed found their way to our hospital, and our cages became overloaded. One evening at dusk, another noble lady came to our door. "Kiki," called Bobby, shrilly as I opened it. "Good evening," a voice said sweetly. "My name is Lady Cravon. Please could you look after this tawny owl for me?" The Craven estate was at Hampstead Marshall, 5 miles to the northwest of Newbury. "Like you, I love wildlife," she explained, "and no shooting is ever allowed on my estate. But I found this owl on the perimeter along the Enbourne Pond road." "Certainly," we replied, and thanked her. The gunshot wound beneath the wing had torn it an inch from the poor creature's body. We cleaned it gently with Acroflex, removed the visible pellets, and then taped it back to its natural position. We found owls the most appealing of creatures, and wondered whether this one was a male or a female, for in the tawny of the sexes are the same colour, male or female. Yep, we wondered. So this is odd, isn't it? They wondered whether it was a male or female, but they're both the same colour. All at once, I remembered a game which we used to play as children. We simply dangled a plain gold ring on a piece of cotton over an animal or a fertilized chicken's egg. If it began to swing like a pendulum, it was a male, and if in a circle, a female. I fetched a ring and tried it over our new patient. It thought for a second or two, then gradually began to swing very steadily, then quite forcefully in a circle. "We will name her Bess," I said. It was time for Bess to be retired to a usual dark confined corner for intensive care patients to prevent movement and to enable her to recover quietly from her injury. Some nights later, the telephone rang and woke us up from our sleep. A couple at Bucklebury were watching over a fox that they had found shot in a wooded area near their cottage and asked if we could or would fetch it. We dressed swiftly and started up the ambulance. "Oh dear, that has disturbed our Bobby," Yvonne said, as its excited chattering began again. "Be quiet, you naughty boy. You'll wake the neighbourhood." We proceeded on our way. The cottage was situated out in the wilds, and we found it with some difficulty. The poor animal was in distress, and we motored home with Yvonne nursing it on her lap. Having parked the van in its usual place near the church, we walked up the alleyway. An uncanny stillness hung in the air at the hour of 2 in the morning. There is something wrong, I said suddenly. Bobby is not calling. He must have heard us, Yvonne remarked in a puzzled tone. We deposited our patient swiftly in the warmth of the kitchen before attending to it and went outside to look at his cage. There was silence, not even the flap of wings, and we shone a torch inside. Upon the ground of his cage lay his little body, motionless, and I opened the door and took him in my hands. His grey and white flecked feathers were intact, and there was no evidence anywhere of an intruder's entry into his cage. The wire was untouched, yet Bobby was dead. John Gould was fixing a wooden seat on Kelston, his 30-foot motor launch, early in the morning, and stopped when he heard the news. I will come over, he said at once, and examined the sad little bundle of feathers. That is a mink. A mink? Yes, that is what done it. He separated the feathers at the back of Bobby's neck. Just look here. At the base of the skull was a bite, which we'd not seen in the darkness. Mink attack their prey at the back of the neck like other members of the weasel family. Then they suck its blood. One of them must have escaped from the farm. But there's no sign of where it could have got in. It would have squeezed under the wire. You see, it is not pinned to the ground. He looked over to the other side of the canal. I suppose it's living along the bank somewhere. You know, I have watched those mink gnawing a hole in the cage for a whole week until they can get out. I've warned the butcher many times. He owns them. As we buried Bobby in the garden, with tears in our eyes, we planted a forsythia shrub where he lay. That's the end of chapter 4. I'll have one more sip of drink. I still got my eye on those birds out there, and I can hear the ducks there as well. They're out there again. They're always coming around. I haven't got a hospital here, just got wildlife in vision of my lovely flat, lovely view of a beautiful garden, which is left alone by majority of the people who could go in it. They don't, which is nice, because there's only one way in and one way out, you see, so it's quite a long garden, but it's lovely, it's beautiful. Okay, I'm going to continue with chapter 5, and its title is just 1967. That's when my Aunt Layla was born, May the 10th. Oh, bless her. When March arrived, the blossoms burst forth, smiling as golden as the spring sun. Bobby's spirit was alive and with us, as bright as it always been. The strange thing was that little Eno always chose that shrub to lie under, panting after he'd been scampering around as if he knew it was something special. He was a cute little chap and had grown to 3/4 of his full size. He would trot around with inquisitively and dancing on his back legs to see into the cages as we performed our rounds. The spring approached, and by May we were immersed with the usual boxes of nestlings and fledglings in their numbers, and we worked tirelessly. The strong survived, and the weak succumbed. But it was a well-rewarding task. Yet, not only did the feathered creatures find their way to us, but a surprising number of other things. And when one morning Brian Sanders popped his head round the unlocked door and called, "Anyone at home?" He'd brought a little white kid, Someone found her tethered in a lane, starving. She was left by gypsies. As you see, she only has one teat. I said I thought I knew someone who would take her. He ventured apologetically. Although I know you are a wildlife hospital, bring her in, we chorused. The little animal's ribs were like a greyhound's, her spirit downcast. Come along, Lucy, I said, without thinking, giving her a huge bowl of milk, plus apples, and which she munched hungrily. And then I attempted to comb her matted hair. When Brian had departed, we put her to roam freely in garden, and at night made her a comfortable bed of straw in the shed. After a week or two, we were pleased to see that her coat was becoming healthy again, as a seance should be, and her body was gradually putting on flesh. Also, we thought she was happy, and she did not take long to prove it. Each morning, as we opened her shed door, she bounded, leaping around like a springbok, as skittish as a young goats are. We became attached to her, and every day we took her for walks with us over the swing bridge and back past the lock, so that she would get her natural food, leaves and plants. There she always met John Gould with Buffer, who made a fuss of her, and she'd chomp away happily pruning his rose bushes. But one day Lucy went missing. We searched for her everywhere in the garden, but she was nowhere to be seen, and we became worried. An hour passed, and a telephone call came from a shop owner to say that she was down Northbrook Street, the main street of Newbury, in the busy road. We hurried down and fetched her, bringing her back on a lead, and put her in the garden again. But once Lucy had savoured the delights of the wide world outside, she found the grass on the other side greener, and one day John Gould rang the doorbell. Look who I found outside Woolworths, he announced. It was Lucy, attached to a piece of string. Whatever can we do with you, Lucy? Gasped Yvonne, her hands on her hips. We did not want to keep her tethered. John had a paddock and a good high fence, and an idea crept through my mind. I knew he had an eye for Lucy, and I ventured. Would you like her? The thought had not occurred to him, and he considered for a moment. Well, now you would. What would you say, Buffer? And Buffer looked up and gave a woof of approval. The matter had been decided, and so Lucy went to live at the lock-keeper's cottage, where the passers-by got to know her and would offer her a titbit from their lunch. It became common even to see John walking down the town with her on a lead, or to the vet to have her hooves trimmed, as is the proper care of goats. Not a soul batted an eyelid. The rector of St. Nicholas Church also knew her well, and one Christmas a request came for her to take part in the forthcoming nativity play. Would she mind standing by the crib? Lucy had no objection, and played her part so well that she could have won an Oscar. Years later, when we heard that Lucy had died, she'd lived to the age of 16, and because she'd been associated with the holy matters, the Reverend Chris Savage buried her solemnly in the churchyard. Meanwhile, Brian called again, and as he sipped his mug of tea, with Eno on his lap, he remarked, What about that aviary? Do you not think it's about time you had one? You've room in the back garden. We looked at him surprised. Aviaries were expensive, and he well knew that. Our pin money was needed for feed and medical care of the patients. We should need at least £50, I commented. He winked. I might know where I can find it. Are you going to do a robbery? Maybe. He held back his head, giving a chuckle, and depositing Eno on the floor, departed to his next call, so that we forgot all about it. The next newcomer was a feral pigeon. We had many pigeons to care for, but this one was so identical to Percy, with his orange eyes, metallic green neck, feathers and white and grey of the rest of his body, that we named him Percy too. We did not know that Percy too was to become as special as the first. Brian turned up 2 weeks later, and to our surprise had a letter in his pocket. We tore it open. Inside was a cheque for £50, worth £500 today. We will have that aviary up in no time, he said. Better get planning permission. It took us 3 weeks to obtain it from the council, and we were ready to go. Brian arrived with the materials: cement, posts, netting, wood, varnish, nails, screws, hinges, and a lock enough to build an aviary, 20 feet in length and 12 feet wide. We got to work that very day. With great enthusiasm, we set the posts in concrete. When sufficiently firm, we secured the netting all round. At the weekend, we began building the partitions, double doors, and lastly, made a good strong roof. It was a marvellous job, and took up the whole of the back garden. It had taken the three of us a fortnight to build. It happened to be September, and excitement reigned in the town. This month there was to be a Newbury Festival Week, a week that purported to be crammed with events, terminating in a carnival. A coachload was expected to join in the celebrations from Newbury's twin town of Braunfels, and in their honour a German Biergarten had been arranged in the Victoria Park, accompanied by lusty beer drinking songs played from the bandstand. On the opening day, Sunday the 17th, there was to be a concert in the Corn Exchange, given by the Newbury Festival Concert Orchestra and the Newbury Operatic Society. During the week there would be shows, dances and exhibitions. A pop music competition in the Corn Exchange, judged by the well-known radio disc jockey Tony Blackburn, while throughout the Friday night a £450 ox would begin to roast on a spit in the market square, to be ready to be partaken of by all next day at the carnival. To rule over all the proceedings there would be a festival queen. She would be chosen from among the local pretty girls at a grand ball to be held in the plaza on the 7th, and two of the judges would be the well-known Newbury radio star Basil Jones, who played John Tregoran in The Archers, and Neil McCullum of BBC TV's Vendetta. When the evening of the ball arrived, the band struck up the opening music, and the atmosphere was electric. 12 lovely finalists lined up before the jury to be chosen for their personality, grace, beauty, and ability to converse. The winner was selected at last. It was 20-year-old Christine Jones, a hotel receptionist at the Chequers, and amidst great applause, the mayor, Councillor Christopher Hall, placed the crown on her head. Christine's first engagement would be to attend the Newbury Agricultural Show the day before the festival began. To host the functions throughout the week, to assist Tony Blackburn with the judging of the pop music festival on the Tuesday, and her last was to ride in honour in a 1913 Lancaster car at the Newbury Carnival. And on Monday the 18th, her duty was to open our aviary. The aviary stood smart and ready, had white ribbon hung across its double doors, while shrubs and trees containing roosting boxes decorated the edges. It looked a treat and a credit to Brian's intuition. The awaited day proved warm and sunny. At 2 o'clock, a crowd comprising of Brian and Betty, his wife, the chairman of the RSPCA fundraising committee, several RSPCA members, John Gould, our neighbours, friends, and a host of onlookers, together with a reporter from the Newbury Weekly News. They waited expectantly. Christine had begun and been spotted rounding the church in the official car. She stepped out, the sun illuminating her beautiful blonde hair piled high upon her head and enhancing her bright blue sash worn from her shoulder, bearing the title Newbury Festival Queen. Elegantly she walked towards the hospital, shook hands with us all with a smile, and we led her to the back garden. "My goodness, it is magnificent!" she exclaimed, upon seeing the aviary. Ceremoniously she cut the ribbon and announced that it was officially open. Everyone cheered, and bottles of champagne were popped. "Would you like to see round the hospital?" we asked, and then prevailed upon her to perform the honour of releasing Percy too, who was now ready to go. She took him delightedly in her hands. Percy, too, apprehensive at first, gave a quiet woo-woo in his affectionate way as she spoke to him, then balancing himself on the palm of her hand, made his departure, soaring into the air and alighting on the church roof. Then, as if considering what to do, he took off, circling in the air, and flew away. On the Thursday it came about that Percy, too, was given a special mention along with our hospital in a 5.5-inch column on the festival page in the Newbury Weekly News. That is the end of chapter 5. So I'm now going to share with you chapter 6, 1968. I've already recorded this today, but it's uploaded already. But I wanted to do as many chapters as possible for Deborah as a birthday. Well, she just loves wildlife. She's going to love this story because anything about wildlife, she just loves the people who look after wildlife as she does herself. So I will continue, but I'll have another sip of drink because I'm not sure. Chapter 6 is in 1968. The patients at the Wildlife Hospital took to their aviary as the ducks had taken to the pond. Rooks, crows, magpies, and pigeons, to name but a few, poured in during April and May, and amongst them was a nest of blackbirds, whose beautiful song at dawn was a treat to hear. The earthen floor of the aviary, around which they all pottered before learning to fly, it served as a ready exercise and acclimatization before returning to the great world outside. A gentle song thrush with a wounded leg was amongst them, and we called her Laura. We loved to watch her, with her beautiful spotted breast, ranging from cream to buttermilk. She would hop along the ground, listening attentively, her head cocked to one side, and then quick as lightning would stab at the earth and pull up a worm. Sometimes she discovered a snail amongst the foliage, which she would thrash against a stone, retrieving the contents from the broken shell. As soon as she recovered from her injury, we released her. At the weekend came 2 orphan tawny owls brought by a very young boy. Their nest was destroyed, he told us. I cannot keep them because I have to go back to boarding school. You will take care of Woo and Woe for me, will you not? His little face looked so dejected that I said reassuringly, Of course, Sam. Now you can go back to school, and you will have no need to worry at all. We put Woo and Woe, hardly a month old, into a roosting box, and they nestled together on their perch, blinking at their new surroundings. When Brian called upon us one day, owls and kestrels watched suspiciously from the trees in the aviary. Cheeky magpies and jackdaws sprang amongst the foliage, while the host of fledglings trilled from the boxes in the end partition. He talked to them animatedly, seeming satisfied with handiwork. Suddenly we heard him calling, Look! And went to where he was standing. A thrush was returning with worms and pushing them through the netting into tiny gaping mouths, feeding all and sundry. That must be Laura, we exclaimed, fulfilling her mother instincts. We'd seen it all before. A fledgling blackbird that we had reared, only just able to peck itself, had been feeding the 3 others in that same aviary. Meanwhile, Woo and Woe were thriving well, growing day by day. It was always heartening to observe patience surviving to maturity, and we wished it for these 2 more than any other, as they were the pets of the young boys. Spring turned into summer, when running a wildlife hospital never ceased to be without its surprises. We answered the doorbell at 7 one evening, and there stood a lady clutching a heron. I have brought it all the way from Scotland. Scotland? I was returning from holiday and found it on the Clyde, covered in oil. Well, it's great to know that they're caring people like you, we answered, and took it from her. Thank goodness it had obviously not swallowed too much oil, or it would never have survived the journey. And there was hope of saving it swiftly. We administered vitamins through a funnel with a long tube, obtained from the vets, knowing it would be dehydrated. Our next task was to set about removing the clinging black grease first and foremost from the parts which it would try to preen. We worked and worked on its plumage, rubbing swastika into its wings and breast and immersing it after each stage in washing up liquid and hot water. Finally, we rubbed liquid paraffin into its feathers to restore their natural oils. Next, we cleaned its long legs and razor-sharp beak, nature's weapon to spear its prey while standing on the river. In normal circumstances, we would never have been able to do this. In the wild, if you do not approach a heron delicately and as quick as lightning, grab its neck, it will slash you or even blind you. But Archie was weak and had not the will to protect himself. After several days, he began to recover his dignity again, and in the typical way of fish eating, birds took a heron a herring which we threw to him, seizing it in the centre of its body, lifting his head and turning it round to eat it, head first, so that he would not choke. One day I went into his cage and startled him. Archie regurgitated his food whole onto the ground, giving me as much of a surprise as he had had. We learned so much simply from watching wildlife close at hand. This was the wildlife. This was the characteristics of herons. It was time to take our usual stroll with Eno along the canal. We'd not gone far when an Alsatian pup came bounding up to us, asking for fuss, and we stopped. His mistress was following behind with a little girl and a baby in a buggy. We patted the puppy's light brown head enhanced by a black V, and he placed his paw in my hand. "How do you do? What is your name then?" I asked. "That's Rusty," volunteered the little girl. "And how old is he?" 12 weeks," answered her mother. "But I'm afraid we cannot keep him any longer. He is jealous of the new baby. You see, it is terrible." "Oh dear. And have you found another home for him?" She shook her head. "We've asked everywhere, but it's not easy homing a dog that has a temperament. He has one more week or else," she added worriedly. I looked at Rusty's pleading eyes, begging for his life. "Give us your telephone number," I said. "If we hear of anybody, we will let you know." That night, for some reason, I could not get that dog out of my mind. I tossed and turned until Yvonne woke up. "Whatever is the matter?" "That pup, he's pleading, his expression keeps coming back to me. But what can you do about it?" "We could have two dogs, could we not?" She sat up, incredulous. "A Pekingese and an Alsatian?" I ignored the remark. "Did you not think he was a lovely dog?" "He was gorgeous." "What is wrong then?" I thought someone once spoke about going from the sublime to the ridiculous. We collected Rusty the next day and brought him home. There did not seem to be any problem with him getting on with a Pekingese. They both took to each other like a long-lost pals, chasing around the house, and children being severely admonished if they disturbed the wildlife, and afterwards would lie down exhausted together in Rusty's dog bed. Although Eno was the senior by 2 years, it was he who decided when they had had enough rest. He would lick Rusty impetuously round his face, and having incited him to start playing again, put his head inside his mouth. Each evening, as soon as the word walk was mentioned, and collars went and leads were fastened on, Eno would pick up Rusty's lead and pull him out of the door. Watching the two was always a comedy, and one day we had an idea. To earn some extra money, we put an advert in the Newbury Weekly News. "Dog owners, why not join in the fun and bring your pet to dog training classes every Monday evening, 7:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. at St. Nicholas's Church Hall, West Mills, Newbury, 2 and 6 shillings per session." For this, we always provided a free cup of tea, and people turned up with dogs of all shapes and sizes. There were mongrels, a retriever, there was a digger, a red setter who constantly dug up his master's vegetable bed. Quite uncontrollable, he told us. A lady brought along Josephine, a black cocker spaniel, who was quiet, quite the opposite. 2 Jack Russells arrived, who frolicked and tumbled over one another. A dachshund stood snootily, ignoring the rest. There were 3 Labradors and a Doberman who turned out to be as gentle as he looked. Fierce Eno and Rusty regarded all these intruders with surprise and curiosity, thinking it a wonderful opportunity to have a game, and nosed their new-found friends in delight. "Right now," I called, clapping my hands to get attention above all the commotion, when all were assembled in the hall. "Let us begin with some obedience training." The first exercise was spent teaching the dogs to halt, and then return to their owners. The second, encouraging them to guard a basket or their owner's gloves at the door of a shop. 2 chairs placed apart served the purpose. Both exercises created a great deal of amusement. Most of the dogs spent their time doing exactly the opposite, but the star of the show was Josephine. She performed all her duties to perfection. The next week, we played at scenting. Each owner had been asked to bring along his pet's toy. All the dogs were then shut outside in the passage, and the toys were placed together in the centre of the room. Then they were all let in together. Digger bounded for his spotted ball, called measles, while a Jack Russell charged in and out of his legs and sent him sprawling. A Labrador had hold of one end of a slipper and the retriever the other. Both tugging, barking, and squealing, Rusty seized a one-eared teddy, which did not belong to him, and charged off with it, with Eno at his heels, while a mongrel sat with a pink rabbit in his mouth, growling at Josephine and daring her to touch it. They were happy, and we were happy. But there is a saying that happiness is a fleeting thing. In the midst of it, suddenly misfortune struck, and the reason was one that no one would have expected. Ever since we had left London, I had felt my body was beginning to suffer a sex change. I had ignored it for years, but its progression suddenly developed beyond control, and I knew I had to succumb to it. I decided to dress as a woman and changed my name from Louis to Louise VENICE, while Yvonne and I agreed that we would become known as the VENICE sisters. In those days, this condition was scorned by the Medical Association, and I received no help whatsoever. It was also scorned by St. Nicholas's Church, where I was the verger. The position was always held by a man, and we were given notice. As we sat devastated by the canal on that sad summer's evening, its grand edifice loomed majestically over the water, and the mill stood silently in the glow of the setting sun. The 40-foot launch, limply stoked, was returning through the lock, and John waved from the helm as he passed, ferrying a crowd of holiday-makers back home. He had not heard the news. We watched the swallows and martins circling and sweeping over the water after insects. Within a month, they too would be returning to a warmer land, and the summer would be over. Without the wildlife hospital, who would care for their young, born late in the year, the fledglings too immature to fly across the mammoth seas to South Africa and left behind to face the cruelty of winter? How could we desert them? The words of Kipling suddenly ran through my mind. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn along after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will, which say to them, hold on, yours is the earth and everything that is in it. Yvonne continued, well, is that not us? I asked. I suppose so. We have won before, and we will win again, I vowed. And as always, we did. That's the end of chapter 6. I will read chapter 7 and then I will stop after that because it's quite a lot of reading I've done today. Chapter 7 is based in 1968 and 1969. It would be surprising how many tales the River Kennet could tell of centuries past, as it ran through the town of Newbury since 1810. Of course, it had been converted into the Kennet and Avon Canal, yet it was nonetheless a site of antiquity. As we sat by the river that August evening, we noticed that one of the shops numbered 17 West Mills, comprising 2 was unoccupied. How about seeing if we could rent it and sell antiques? Yvonne suggested. Out of the blue, I wondered why I had not thought of the idea myself. How often we had spent many a happy hour at Petticoat Lane or the Portobello Road, browsing through the antique stalls, returning with many a treasure. But we had to find out who the landlords were. We guessed that John Gould would know, and he did. The premises belonged to the surveyor in Cheap Street, Alan Seward. So off we went and set the next day and requested the key. Our enthusiasm increased upon looking round the premises. There were 15 rooms in all, plus a piece of ground to the rear, which would be suitable for our wildlife. Accordingly, we applied to the Newbury District Council for permission to open a shop, but we were stunned by the reply. We are sorry, the canal is not a suitable site. Antiques? What a lot of nonsense. I penned a letter to the Ministry of the Environment at Bristol, and in no time an energetic little man was sent down to inspect the premises, who had no hesitation in giving his decision that the canal lent itself ideally to the sale of antiques. And so we moved all of our furniture into the abundance of rooms. When this time the council informed us that the premises were condemned and were not to be used for living in. What was it that they had against us? We sensed the reason. They did not approve of our wildlife. It seemed as if the odds were against us. But never to be outdone, we wondered if one of the largest estate owners might have a cottage which we could inhabit, and at the same time run the shop. I decided to write a letter to each one. A reply came by return of mail. It bore an armorial crest and was from the Countess of Craven. Dear Miss VENICE, thank you for your letter, and I'm very sorry to hear of your situation. I should like to offer you one of my cottages on Irish Hill on the road to Canterbury, and if you wish, you could house your wildlife in the grounds. Would you care to call and see me tomorrow morning for coffee at 11 o'clock? Yours sincerely, signed Elizabeth Craven. The immense Craven estate of 300,000 acres was situated 4 miles west of Newbury. The beautiful landscape, with the River Kennet running through it, was purchased by the first Earl of Craven and 13th Viscount Uffington in 1620. The great manor house which he built, resembling Heidelberg Castle, had been burnt down in the early 18th century. So the family had then extended their hunting lodge and moved into it. It was there in 1963, just 5 years ago, that the 6th Earl of Craven had died tragically of leukemia at the age of 47, leaving the present Countess with 3 young children. 3 years later, Lady Craven had married her loyal estate manager, Kenneth Banner, and they had moved into a newly built dower house nearby. The day after we received the letter, we made our way to the Onbourne Road and, turning off, drove up a private avenue leading to a gateway bearing the family crest and surmounted by figures of griffins. Before us stood the splendid white manor house, Hampstead Lodge, which they now let as a nursing home, and following the road curving up to the right, we reached the dower house and rang the bell. It was opened by the butler, who ushered us into the sizable saloon, and Lady Craven soon appeared, slim and attractive, with sapphire blue eyes. I'm sorry to say that since writing to you, I have received a disappointment, she began. An old lady lives in the cottage adjoining the one which we had in mind for you, and she has expressed a wish not to have her peace disturbed. It is a delicate situation. You see, her husband was killed by a tractor while working on our estate, and she has been granted the right to live in the cottage for the rest of her life. Have we anywhere else where the sisters could live, dear? She asked, as a pleasant man with ruddy complexion entered the room. It was Kenneth Banner who came and sat with us. There are only the 4 cottages at Enbourne, which I intend to bulldoze at some time. Oh, yes, the disused cottages on Lucken's farm. An authoress was the last person to occupy one until her death, but it would not be habitable now. She considered for a moment, and then an idea dawned. What about the residential caravans? Could we not make a present of it to them? I do not see why not, her husband replied. They could park it on the green in front of the cottages, and if they wished, use them to shelter their animals. Yvonne and I looked at each other in surprise and expressed our gratitude. I will take them to see the caravan, he offered, and finished his coffee. The cream caravan was parked a short distance down the road. He looked over it. It was 22 feet in length, fully carpeted and appointed with utensils. Everything but linen. It was fully carpeted, it was appointed with everything but linen and cooking utensils. It was a gift from heaven. All we needed to do was to tow it to the site. Our life at Enbourne turned out to be something quite unique. The site lay in the centre of the Lux farm, and after walking over farm fields, we reached the 4 Georgian cottages, which were now hidden behind a hopeless mass of overgrown gardens. The green stretching in front of them was a good size, but the problem was there was no water, electricity, or toilets. We guessed the cottages must have had some form of water supply, and we decided to look around. A dilapidated elm fence enclosed the gardens. I climbed over it first and suddenly found the ground giving way beneath my feet. Clutching wildly at the fence, I pulled aside the long grass. Upon recovering, and discovered an uncovered well. Bodies of dead rats and rabbits were floating deep down in the water. Without any hesitation, we searched around and found a piece of corrugated iron and some heavy stones with which to cover it up. On walking back to the farmhouse, we came across the farmer himself, hat on, busily engaged in milking his Hereford herd. "Hello!" he called, then in sudden recognition paused from his work and came over, holding out a large hand. He was a plump, jolly man, and his broad face beamed. "I'm Cyril Lux. You must be the ladies coming to live on the green. Sure, the tap is over there," and pointing to it, offered us the use of it. any time we wished. We thanked him, and once out of earshot, Yvonne held her sides, laughing. What a character! Did you see what he was sitting on doing the milking? No, a Chippendale chair. Towing the caravan to the site was beyond us. It was a test of ingenuity, and the only way was to make a detour. We employed a man in Newbury with a Land Rover and paid him £5 to perform the operation, which he achieved by fighting his way through narrow lanes and finally mountaineering a railway bank. He returned home a ball of sweat, declaring he'd earned it. Having dismantled the aviary and cages, we finally moved on Yvonne's birthday, the 30th of August, and arrived at night, Rusty and Eno accompanying us. As we opened the caravan and began making up the beds, the dogs chased around wildly outside, obviously excited at their new surroundings. Every so often an impetuous barking echoed from Rusty, who had found something to sniff at around the cottages. Just look at him, he's going mad, cried Yvonne, looking out of the window. The outbuildings of the cottages possessed low sloping roofs, and Rusty was on his hind legs, about to spring up on the end to the end one. As he achieved it, his barking became even louder, and using it as a springboard, he leapt onto the cottage roof where the slates had slipped off, his body quivering, his hackles up. Suddenly he seized a rat as it ran along the bare rafters. Eno was waiting at the bottom expectantly as Rusty descended with a tail hanging out of his mouth. Ugh. The night passed without disturbance, and 6 o'clock arrived the next morning to fetch water. Taking 2 buckets apiece, we set off over the 3 fields. Cyril Lux was up early, washing down his milking parlour, and stopped while we stood waiting as the water rushed into the buckets. In chatting, we discovered he had an interest in antiques. Obviously, not only did he possess his priceless milking stool, but a set of old masters stored up in his loft. We wondered if they had reached the same fate of the nonentity as the Chippendale chair. We were soon to learn that everyone in the village knew him. Not only was he chairman of the parish council, but a governor of the little Enbourne school, a warden of the church, and every Sunday afternoon he waved to all and sundry as he cantered around the lanes upon a hunter as well as built as he was taking his weekend exercise. We staggered back home, the water slopping in the buckets. We supplied it to the dogs, boiled some for our own needs, and soon as we'd had breakfasted, decided to explore the cottages. We put our shoulders to the door of the first. It heaved open with a jerk, surprising a heap of empty bottles, which descended to the ground. As we ventured into each of the rooms, we were met with even more. They had contained a whisky and gin. I remarked that if this was the one the authoress lived in, I wondered she wasn't too sozzled to write. The cottage was, as we expected, it was in a sad state of neglect, and so was each of the others. However, we worked all morning clearing them out, and afterwards went into town to fetch some of the patients, including Woo and Wall, plus Archie and Heron, taking care to strap his beak and wings so that he would not hurt himself in transport, and install them in their new abode. The weekend after our arrival at Enbourne, a Land Rover pulled up along the road, and out stepped the tweed-clad figure of Kenneth Banner. "Good morning," he called. "Lady Craven wondered if you would like to come and have a cup of coffee and meet the children." We said we should be delighted, and at 11 o'clock made our way to the Dower House. In the saloon, 3 little figures, free from their schooling, stood up and shook hands politely. Thomas the heir was a tall, slim lad, and announced that everyone called him Humphrey. The younger boy, Simon, with brown wavy hair, the colour of his brother's, gave a pleasant smile of welcome, while their little sister Anne, too shy to speak, stood demurely by her mother. Coffee was brought to the huge round table in the centre, and Lady Craven asked chattily how we and the patients were settling in at the farm. "The children are very interested in wildlife," she continued. "Would you mind if we come to see your patients sometime?" We looked at their eager faces. "We're going to set our heron free this weekend," we replied. "Would you like to come with us and watch?" "The lake in the parkland would be a good spot," Kenneth Banner volunteered. "I have seen herons there from time to time. The lake is by the river," Humphrey explained. "We will show you if you would like." "Us too, Miss Venice." We said the place sounded ideal. That afternoon, all three children clambered into the van, eyeing Archie's cage curiously. Around us stretched acres of woods, park and farmland, and after wending our way for a quarter of a mile, the scenic lake lay before us. An immense number of waterfowl were performing upon it. Graceful, mute swans glided along slowly, their large bodies reflected in the water. Coots squabbled in the reed beds. Moorhens emerged and disappeared again. Tiny dabchicks dived and bobbed up again after a full minute, while a host of mallard ducks, upon seeing the children, swam over and scrabbled onto the land, quack, greedily for food. Humphrey and Simon had brought a bag of bread and bent feeding them, little Anne begging to be included. As soon as they had finished, I opened Archie's cage and took him out, holding him firmly by the back of the neck. Gasps of wonder came from the children. "Just look at his long legs, and look at his black crest." "Ah, but do you see his beak?" I asked. "It's razor sharp, so that he can spear his fish." "Never touch that." "Shall we let him go?" Humphrey asked at last. "Yes," I agreed. "Come on, Archie," and released him. Archie seemed nervous, then suddenly sniffing the fresh air, took off flapping his wings heavily, and with legs outstretched behind him, propelled himself like an aeroplane over the water into the island of trees opposite. We waited, while watching him through the leaves, as still as ever. "Do you think he will show us how he catches a fish?" Simon asked hopefully. "He will need a little time first to adjust to his new surroundings." "May we come and see your hospital tomorrow?" "Come and watch us giving them their breakfast," Yvonne said. The children did, eager to help. By now we had brought several more patients out to Enbourne, and ecstatically they administered seeds and nuts to the small birds, and left the large cubes of steak on the perches for the hawks and owls. Next, Humphrey busied himself breaking up loaves of bread for the swans and ducks, while Anne, overcoming her shyness, begged to help give a baby rabbit her bottle of lacto. Simon stood staring. He was staring at the sleepy owls in wonderment. "I love Woo and Woll," he said, "and I'm going to christen the two others, Tawnies, Snoozy and Snooty." "We had a newcomer yesterday," we told them, "a badger. She was injured on the road. Inspector Bryan had brought her out to us. It was a signal for them all to rush into the second cottage to look. Badger was taking her daytime nap, her handsome black and white striped head tucked into her body. Her legs are strapped up," Simon exclaimed. Yes, it was broken. We have put it in a splint. Could you show us how to mend legs?" "Certainly we will." Very quietly they slipped her plate of apples, meat and grain in through the aperture in her cage, for when she woke up, refilled her bowl with water and crept away. The children were to become regular visitors. We had stocked the shop with our own items of bric-a-brac as a means of starting up. and as we had insufficient money to purchase antiques directly, we advertised in the local paper, offering to sell items for commission in the shop. The telephone rang as soon as the paper came out, and our first caller asked, "I have a grandfather clock for sale. Could you sell it for £7?" We fetched it in our van, and as we were unloading it, an onlooker called, "I'll give you £16 for that." And the clock had gone. After that time, we sold many grandfather clocks, mostly to Americans, who took them back home and no doubt resold them for many times more. I often reflected on how sad it is that half of England, together with London Bridge, is on the other side of the Atlantic. We found that rummaging amongst jumble sales or even Steptoe's yards revealed pieces of value, and one day we discovered a large metal dragon in a deplorable state of verdigris. We brought it home, used half a tin of brasso on it, and even larger amount of elbow grease. It polished up so well and was such a good saleable attraction that it did not take any time for a dealer to spot it. "Good heavens, you should not have polished that," was his reaction. "That is bronze. One only cleans bronze with hot soapy water." In those days there was no Arthur Negus to educate folk into taking a second look at grandmother's piece of china or turn out their attics for heirlooms. We were by no means connoisseurs either. But we were to learn by experience, and experiences were meant. The door opened, and in came a lady, unwrapping a small object. "Could you sell this for me for £5?" I took it from her. It was a milk jug with nothing attractive to offer it. "Well, I will try," I replied dubiously, and when she'd gone out, she remarked to Yvonne, "We'll never get £5 for that." I'd not had it for 10 minutes before a man came in and asked how much we wanted for it. "That little jug in the window?" I took it out. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, and handled it lovingly. "This is old Lowestoft. The spout is a sparrow beak, and it's a very rare piece. They were only made for 15 years. You could have asked anything you liked for it." He was the curator of a museum. One day we were given an old oil painting to sell, upon which one could just discern a harbour in Venice. It was gloomy and unappealing, and we stood it on a table. "How much do you want for that?" asked a customer with a cigar in his mouth. £50. The man handed over the money and took it away without quibbling. Shortly afterwards he invited us to come and see it. He had had the picture cleaned, erected a light over it, was transformed to beauty. It was by an Italian master. But the prize story was the portrait of a water spaniel, which we hung together with others on the wall. A lady browsing round the shop stopped suddenly and singled it out. £60, we asked of her. Obviously the sort of lady able to buy whatever took her eye. She did not hesitate. It was by sheer chance, 2 years later, that we bumped into her housekeeper in the street, who had since left her employ. "Do you remember that painting of a dog which Mrs. B bought from you? She sold it, you know, at Sotheby's for several £1,000s. What do you think it was?" We waited curiously. "No idea. A Stubbs. We laugh when we think about it now, but at that time we were making enough money to feed our wildlife, and that was all we really asked. Then one terrible day, misfortune struck. We arrived to open up the shop, and were shattered to find a policeman waiting there. "There's been a burglary," he said apologetically. The lock had been forced, and we looked around in tears. Every room had been ransacked. As the months crept on, our shop became a target for even more robberies, one after the other. We became hopelessly in debt and had no capital to buy any more stock. Then it seemed as if we were quite miraculously saved by our guardian angel, and we were able to carry on. The telephone rang, and a voice asked, "I'm leaving the country and would like to clear my house. Could you come and have a look at it?" It was a lady who lived in the town. We arrived and could not believe our eyes. Every room resembled an Aladdin's cave. "We're sorry, dear," we said to her. "We just do not have that kind of money. You will have to ask somebody else." "But I want you to have it," she insisted, surprisingly. "I have a love of wildlife, and I do not want more than £30 for the lot." We looked at each other. One piece alone was a Dresden oil lamp surrounded with porcelain and surmounted by a white bowl. It was exquisite, and alone was worth more than the sum she was asking for the whole house. But the lady was adamant, so we loaded up our van. That collection was sufficient to settle our debts and to keep us going for 6 months. We were returning home early from the shop one Friday afternoon when Kenneth Banner stopped his Land Rover about to pull into the drive and asked, "Care to join us for a cup of tea?" We thanked him and followed him up the avenue of elms. Lady Craven welcomed us as gracious as ever, and as she poured us each a cup, we sensed that there was something on her mind. "We must thank you for putting up with the children so often," she said. "They love to see your hospital." Kenneth Banner passed the plate of fruit cake. "Children are a problem today, are they not?" he remarked, voicing his thoughts aloud. "In these so-called liberated 60s, there are so many bad influences to corrupt them, do you not think? Drugs, promiscuity, violence, street demos. It makes bringing them up a headache instead of a pleasure. I believe Louise and Yvonne have had quite a lot of dealings with young people," Lady Craven stated before we could reply. "Have you really?" he asked, sugaring his tea. "Tell us about them." We related how we had run the church clubs for poor boys to take them off the streets of London. There were who frightened and browbeaten to those who were tough teddy boys, we assured them. But we got them all interested in sports and competing for cups. By teaching them the right way, they usually developed into responsible adults. That is why we consider it essential to encourage our children in worthwhile occupations, Lady Craven added. "We like them to visit your hospital to learn how to become caring citizens. Simon, in particular, is simply fascinated by your owls. Well, we hope to set 2 tawnies free just before dark," I replied, having decided that Woo and Wool were ready to go. "Do you think they would like to join us before supper?" That evening we called for the children, who were waiting eagerly. Before we departed, Simon stood gazing into their cage and talking to them. "Do they have to go?" he asked sadly. "They're my favourites, Woo and Woe." "You cannot keep them forever, you twit," called Big Brother Humphrey. "Come on, get in." We drove to the edge of the woods upon the estate, darkness beginning to fall already. Leaving the car, we took out the cage carefully, and the 5 of us walked a distance along the tree-lined track. Twigs cracked under our feet, and the wind shivered throughout the branches. "It's a bit spooky," commented Humphrey. "You'd better hold my hand, Anne. Here is a nice large oak tree," Yvonne announced at last, sensing the mass form. "How about here?" We put the cage down and opened it, but nothing stirred. "How about, oh dear, come along," the children called softly, but there was no response. Woo and Woe refused to go. "I expect they like the hospital too much," said Anne. Simon put leather gloves on and lifted Wu out, who clung to his fingers. Then, taking him to the lowest branch of the oak, he coaxed him onto it. Wu stayed there for some minutes and eventually hopped into the shelter of a higher branch. Suddenly, by sheer chance, the hoot of an owl, "Ooh," quavered from the heart of the woods, and Wal, as if by magic, flew out deftly from his cage into the oak and became lost in the foliage. "Do you think they will be all right?" the children asked anxiously, after we'd waited a little while. "We will make sure. We will come again tomorrow morning to see if they've gone." We turned back. "Yesterday evening I saw a barn owl returning with a mouse in its claws to the stable clock tower," Simon announced importantly as we walked home. "When I'm grown up, I would simply love to make a wildlife park here. Do you think you could help me, Miss Louise and Yvonne?" Next morning, being a Saturday, we walked with the children back again through the woods. As we neared the oak tree, a great disturbance was coming from that direction. Rooks were flying around, cawing loudly and mobbing something in which they obviously regarded as a predator. We hurried towards the tree and clapped our hands, shooing them away. Then, looking up into the leaves, we could see two creatures huddled together miserably on a bough, awakened from their daytime snooze. It was Wu and Wal. The children cried out at once, "Oh dear!" I called to them and whistled, and to everyone's surprise, they both flew deftly from the bough towards us and alighted on my arms. We fetched the emergency cage from the van and took them back to their sanctuary. Wu and Wal were happy once again, and so was Simon. The spring brought the rains. The farm lanes where the cows had trodden became a sea of mud, and we had to wear our wellies each time we crossed to fetch water. One day, having traversed an even more squelchy track than usual, we stopped at the first field, our hearts missing a beat. It was occupied by a Hereford bull who stood grazing on the far side. There was no one in sight to assist us, and we debated what to do. No other way led to the farmhouse, and we wondered if we could make it across before he spotted us. The bull appeared to be taking no notice, so we climbed the fence stealthily. When halfway over the field, he suddenly saw us and began advancing. Petrified, we sprinted the rest of the way, envisaging a charging hulk of 400 weight, his head held down, and we vaulted the gate like hunted deer. On reaching the dairy, Cyril Lukes appeared, mesmerized by our ashen faces. "You mean you were afraid of Ferdy?" He let out a roar of laughter, holding his side. "He's as docile as a lamb." Next day, there was a knock on the caravan door. Yvonne opened it to find Cyril Lux standing there with the bull. "Meet Ferdy," he said. "Come on, stroke him." He put his arm round him. We did. Ferdy moved his head up and down in enjoyment, waiting for more. The spring provided the usual orphan fledglings in their scores, and our patients were increasing. All kinds of garden, moorland, woodland, and water birds were brought to us by workers on the estate, and Brian continued to bring us casualties at the shop. We also found ourselves caring for baby foxes, a squirrel, and even a polecat. In time, we erected additional aviaries upon the green. Alas, not only was the hospital capacity increasing, but it was becoming obvious that the rats were too. On discovering one in an aviary hunting for food one day, we called to Rusty, "Rat! Rat!" The very word caused him to go wild with excitement. His hackles stood up, the whites of his eyes gleamed, and tearing away at the wire from beneath the ground, he burrowed his way in. The terrified victim had shut up in a tree in the aviary, but Rusty shook the tree madly in his paws and pulled that up as well. In an instant, he'd seized the rat and tossed it into the air dead. That night, as we were lying in bed, high-pitched squeals came from beneath the caravan. They'd come to live underneath. Rusty scratched feverishly, whimpering to get out, and after we'd opened the door, his excited barking echoed each time he caught one. But soon there were far too many for him to deal with. We had become infested. The summer passed and the wrath of winter began approaching. The journey for water in the early mornings became cold and miserable. Cyril Lux, seeing us frozen, would invite us into the farmhouse and call to his wife to provide us with a drop of the hard stuff. Before going on our way, it was welcome, and we would warm ourselves in front of the cheerful log fire. "Do the children still come and see your hospital?" his wife asked chattily one day. "Regularly, despite the weather," we told her. "Simon loves making up names for them all. They really are a delightful family." She agreed and mumbled thoughtfully, "I often think about that terrible gypsy curse upon them and wonder if it's true." "What curse?" "Have you never heard that the first earl who bought the estate in 17th century made a servant girl pregnant, and he wouldn't marry her? She came from gypsy stock and swore by bell book and candle that every heir should die young." "And they have?" "Yes. Every single one has met an early death, if you read about it, although the family does not believe the curse." She shrugged. "But you can take it whichever way you like." We shuddered, but time was getting near for us to go into the shop, and we were preoccupied by our own worries. There'd even been another robbery. We decided the only thing to do was to part with Rusty and to leave him on guard at night. We shut him in the room where we kept the most valuable items and felt sure that his loud barking and his very presence would be enough to deter any intruder. And we were wrong. A week later, there was another break-in, and the police captured a well-known jail bird by the name of Albie Ford. If Rusty had been let loose, he would virtually have killed him. But the goods were missing. He'd thrown them into the Thames. All that was ever recovered was a canteen of cutlery, which appeared for sale at a shop in Reading. To add to our troubles, that bitterly cold winter had no respite. Water froze and conditions became extreme. After enduring it for as long as we could, we knew we could not undergo another winter in the caravan again. Some months later, we heard a rumour that a shop with partly furnished living accommodation had become vacant in Oxford Street at the top end of the town. It was owned by Jeff Thompson, a coal merchant, and we raced into Newbury to see him. We begged him to let it to us, and he agreed. It was August and time for us to move. On the day of our departure, as we were dismantling the aviaries, the children came to say goodbye to the patients with tears in their eyes. "Please still come and visit us and bring your wildlife to release upon the estate," the whole family begged. We gave them our promise and did so as often as we could. That is the end of chapter 7. Thank you so much for listening. There are 29 chapters, so I'm going to take a break. I'm going to stop the recording now because I doubt if I can even move for the stiffness of sitting so long. So nobody listens, so that's okay. But this is for you, Deborah, anyway. I know you'll find it later on the internet. So it's okay. It's out there now. I'm wishing you a wonderful birthday, and I hope you're going to enjoy. I know you're going to like this book. This story's are marvelous. So nobody listened, but that doesn't matter. Oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I'm just typing up what I did. I read from chapter 1 to chapter 7. Okay, 2 hours and 27 minutes and 10 seconds. Okay. God bless you, Deborah, when you hear this. I hope you enjoy it. I'm sure you will. Bye-bye. Bye.